The islands of Japan rise gently from the Pacific Ocean, a long and slender chain of land shaped by ancient volcanic forces, folded into mountains and valleys, edged with coastlines where the sea moves quietly against dark stone and pale sand. From above, the archipelago might look like a scattering of green jewels resting on the surface of a vast blue expanse, each island connected not by roads or bridges in those early centuries, but by the shared rhythms of seasons, by the movement of fishing boats across narrow straits, and by the slow drift of culture passing from one community to the next. The largest of these islands, Honshu, stretches long and gently curved, its interior filled with mountain ranges that run like the spine of some ancient creature sleeping beneath the earth. The peaks are often hidden in low cloud, wrapped in mist that softens their edges and gives them a quality that feels almost dreamlike. Rivers descend from these mountains in quiet, unhurried paths, threading through cedar forests and open valleys before spreading out into coastal plains where the soil is dark and generous. It was on these plains, beside these rivers, in the shelter of these mountain-rimmed basins, that the villages and towns of early Japan took root and slowly grew. To the south lies Kyushu, warmer and more open to the sea, a place where the influence of neighboring cultures on the Asian continent arrived earliest, carried across the water by small boats and gentle currents. To the northeast, the long island of Tohoku stretches toward colder latitudes, its forests thick and its winters deep and still. And between all of these, the inland sea spreads out like a quiet lake, dotted with small islands, its waters calm and sheltered, a place where boats could travel without fear of the open ocean, where communities on different shores could see one another's lanterns glowing across the water at night. This geography shaped everything. The mountains kept communities separated from one another for long stretches of time, allowing distinct local customs and loyalties to develop. The valleys and plains became the centers of agricultural life, places where rice paddies could be flooded and tended through the growing months, where harvests determined the welfare of entire communities. The sea provided food and connection, but it also marked the edges of the known world, a boundary that would come to hold enormous significance in later centuries when Japan chose to close itself off from the lands beyond. The earliest layers of Japanese society were organized around family groups and clans, communities bound together by shared ancestry and shared land. These clans, known as uji, each had their own traditions, their own patron spirits, and their own relationships with the land they occupied. Leadership within these groups passed along family lines, and the relationship between a clan and its territory was understood as something sacred, something given by the spirits of nature and the ancestors who had first cleared the forest and turned the soil. Over many generations, certain clans grew more powerful than others. Through alliances, through the careful management of agricultural land, and through the slow accumulation of influence, some families came to hold authority over wide stretches of territory. The Yamato clan, centered on the plains of central Honshu, gradually extended its reach across much of the main island, and from this family line emerged the imperial institution that would persist, in some form, through every era of Japanese history. The emperor in early Japan was not simply a political ruler. The position carried a spiritual dimension that set it apart from ordinary authority. The emperor was understood to be descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess of the Shinto tradition, the deity whose light sustained the world and whose goodwill was essential to the harmony of the land. This connection between the imperial line and the divine order of things gave the emperor a kind of sacred legitimacy that no rival could easily claim or replicate. Shinto, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, understood the world as filled with spirits known as kami. These spirits inhabited natural features, mountains and rivers and ancient trees, as well as the forces of weather and the transitions of seasons. Sacred sites were places where the presence of kami was felt most strongly, and shrines were built at these locations, simple wooden structures framed by torii gates that marked the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred. The rituals performed at these shrines were not elaborate or theatrical. They were quiet, careful acts of respect and acknowledgement, the ringing of a bell, the folding of hands, the presentation of a small offering, gestures that recognized the presence of something beyond the human and expressed gratitude for the conditions that made life possible. As the centuries passed, a second great spiritual tradition arrived from the continent, crossing the sea from Korea and China and finding a receptive home in the islands. Buddhism, with its teachings about the nature of suffering and the possibility of liberation, its meditation practices and its richly decorated temples, its monks in their gray and saffron robes, gradually wove itself into the fabric of Japanese life. The two traditions did not replace one another. They coexisted, influencing each other in quiet ways over long stretches of time, until many people moved naturally between them, marking the transitions of their lives with the rituals of one tradition or the other, finding no contradiction in honoring both. Buddhist temples rose beside Shinto shrines in village after village. The temple bell, deep and resonant, became one of the characteristic sounds of the Japanese landscape, its slow tolling carrying across fields and through mountain air in the early morning and at the close of day. Inside the temples, gilded images of the Buddha sat in quiet contemplation, their eyes slightly downcast, their expressions peaceful beyond any ordinary description of peace. Monks moved through their days in patterns of prayer and work and silent sitting, their lives organized around the idea that stillness and simplicity were not merely comfortable but spiritually essential. It was within this layered world of clan politics, imperial authority, agricultural community, and dual spiritual tradition that the warrior class we now call the samurai began to take shape. The emergence of the samurai was not sudden. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, driven by practical necessities and shaped by the particular conditions of Japanese society. In the earlier centuries of the imperial period, the court at the capital managed military affairs through a combination of conscript armies and professional soldiers attached to powerful families. Over time, as the imperial government's direct control over distant provinces became more difficult to maintain, local landowners began to take on greater responsibility for maintaining order and protecting their territories. These landowners needed armed men, skilled fighters who could be trusted and who were trained specifically for the work of protecting land and people. The men who filled this role were mounted warriors, trained from youth in the use of the bow and the sword, skilled in horsemanship, and bound by ties of loyalty to the landowners who employed them. Over generations, this warrior function became hereditary. Families passed their military skills from father to son, and gradually a distinct social class emerged, defined by its relationship to arms, to service, and to a particular understanding of honor and duty. The word samurai carries within it the idea of service, of attending to and supporting a higher authority. The samurai were, at their core, men of service, and this quality of devoted loyalty remained central to their identity through all the changes that followed. A samurai without a lord to serve was a figure of some ambiguity, a person whose skills and training existed without the framework of purpose that gave them meaning. The lords whom the samurai served were themselves embedded in a larger hierarchy of power and obligation. Local warriors served regional lords owed allegiance to more powerful lords, and above all of these, in theory at least, stood the emperor and his court. But the practical mechanics of power in feudal Japan were considerably more complex than any simple pyramid might suggest. The rise of the shogunate represented one of the most significant shifts in the organization of Japanese society. The word shogun derives from a longer title meaning something like general who subdues barbarians, a title originally granted by the emperor to military commanders sent to pacify the northern regions of Honshu. Over time, however, the title came to mean something much larger. When Minamoto no Yoritomo established the first shogunate at Kamakura in the late 12th century, he was creating an entirely new kind of government, a military administration that held real executive power across the country while leaving the imperial institution formally intact. This arrangement, which might seem contradictory from the outside, was actually quite stable in its own particular way. The emperor retained his sacred legitimacy, his ceremonial role, and his symbolic authority. The shogun held military and administrative power. Both institutions needed each other in some sense. The shogun derived a kind of formal legitimacy from the emperor's recognition, and the emperor's court survived under the protection of the military power the shogun commanded. The capital of the imperial court remained at Kyoto, a city of elegant gardens and refined cultural traditions, where the old aristocracy preserved ancient arts and ceremonies with careful devotion. The shogunate, by contrast, established its seat of government elsewhere, first at Kamakura on the eastern coast, and later, under different ruling families, at other locations. This physical separation of imperial and military authority reflected the division of their functions in a way that was quite literal. Kyoto was a beautiful city, built according to principles derived from Chinese urban planning, its streets laid out in a regular grid, its great temples and palaces set among carefully tended landscapes. The gardens of Kyoto were among the most refined expressions of aesthetic sensibility in the feudal world, places where the arrangement of stone and water and carefully pruned trees created environments that invited a particular quality of attention. Walking through such a garden, one was meant to notice things slowly, to follow the path around a bend and encounter a new composition of elements. A moss-covered stone reflected in still water, a single tree whose branches traced a particular shape against the sky, the sound of water moving over smooth pebbles. These gardens embodied a set of aesthetic values that ran very deep in Japanese culture. Among the most central was the concept of wabi, a term that gestures toward the beauty found in simplicity, in imperfection, in things that are quietly understated rather than loudly impressive. A cracked tea bowl, repaired with gold in the technique known as kintsugi, was more beautiful for its history of breaking and mending than a perfect one would have been. A garden with moss and shadow and the sound of rain on broad leaves was more beautiful than one filled with expensive ornaments. This sensibility shaped not only gardens but architecture, poetry, ceramics, the arrangement of flowers in a room, and the manner in which tea was prepared and shared. The tea ceremony, known as chado or the Way of Tea, was one of the great cultural achievements of the feudal period. Its development into a formalized practice is associated particularly with the tea master Sen no Rikyu, who lived in the 16th century, but the roots of the practice reach back further, into the Zen Buddhist monasteries where tea was drunk as an aid to meditation and shared in a spirit of simple communal attention. In its mature form, the tea ceremony was a complete environment of experience. The path leading to the tea house was itself part of the ceremony, a garden path of stepping stones that slowed the visitor's pace and began the process of leaving ordinary concerns behind. The tea house was intentionally small and simple, built of natural materials, its interior spare and carefully arranged. Guests entered by bowing through a small, low doorway, an act that was both practically necessary and symbolically meaningful, as it placed everyone on equal footing regardless of their rank or station in the world outside. Inside, the host prepared the tea with careful, unhurried movements, each gesture precise but not mechanical, attentive but not anxious. The sound of water heating, the soft scrape of the tea scoop against the bowl, the quiet of the room itself, all of these were part of what was being offered. The tea that was served was thick and slightly bitter, bright green, consumed in small sips from a ceramic bowl whose weight and texture in the hands was part of the experience. Conversation, if there was any, was quiet and unhurried. The whole ceremony created a kind of pause in time, a space apart from the rushing concerns of the world, a reminder that complete attention to simple things was itself a form of richness. The philosophy that underpinned much of this aesthetic sensibility was deeply influenced by Zen Buddhism, which arrived in Japan from China during the Kamakura period and found a particularly receptive audience among the warrior class. Zen's emphasis on direct experience rather than textual scholarship, on the cultivation of a particular quality of presence through sitting meditation, on the sudden insight that could arise from a question without a logical answer, all of this appealed to men whose lives were oriented around practice rather than theory, around doing rather than explaining. Zen monasteries became important centers of cultural life during the feudal period, places where not only meditation but painting, calligraphy, poetry, garden design, and the tea ceremony were practiced and refined. The monks who inhabited these monasteries lived according to schedules that balanced silent sitting with physical work, the maintenance of gardens and buildings, the preparation of food, the copying of texts. This integration of practice and labor, the idea that washing dishes and sweeping the courtyard were forms of spiritual activity if done with full attention, had a profound influence on Japanese attitudes toward work and craft. The artisans who produced the material culture of feudal Japan, the potters and weavers and lacquer workers and metal workers, often approached their work with something of this same spirit. A sword maker spent years learning the properties of different irons and steels, the precise temperatures at which metal behaved in particular ways, the exact rhythm of hammering that drew out the desired qualities in the blade. The process was long and demanding and required the kind of sustained, attentive effort that the craftsman might describe in terms that sounded almost spiritual. The best swords were understood as something more than functional objects. They were thought to contain something of the spirit of their makers, and they were treated accordingly, kept in silk, displayed with care, handled with respect. The castle was one of the most visible symbols of power in the feudal landscape. The Great Japanese Castle, with its white plastered walls and sweeping tiled roofs curving upward at the corners, rising tier upon tier above a base of massive stone, was both a practical military structure and a statement of authority. From the highest tower, known as the Tenshu, a lord could look out over the surrounding landscape, the town that had grown up around the castle walls, the agricultural plains beyond, the mountains in the distance, and understand in a single view something of the world he was responsible for governing. The towns that gathered around castle walls were organized communities with their own internal logic. Closest to the castle lived the samurai of highest rank, their compounds and gardens arranged in a zone that separated the military heart of the town from the commercial districts beyond. Further out, the merchants and artisans occupied their own neighborhoods, organized by trade so that particular streets were known for particular goods: the street of dyers, the street of paper sellers, the street of craftsmen who worked in wood. Temples and shrines were distributed through the town in ways that served both spiritual and practical functions, as places of worship but also as landmarks, as centers of neighborhood life, as places where certain seasonal festivals were organized and celebrated. The markets in these castle towns were places of quiet activity on ordinary days, though they quickened considerably on market days when farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their surplus produce to trade. The seasonal rhythms of agriculture shaped the rhythms of market life, and the arrival of the rice harvest in autumn was a time of particular significance, when the year's work was measured and the winter's stores could be assessed. A good harvest meant security and some ease. A poor one meant difficult calculations about how to manage until the following year's planting. The farming villages that supplied these markets were communities of considerable internal complexity despite their outwardly simple appearance. A typical village was a cluster of thatched farmhouses set among the paddies and fields, connected to the nearest town by a road that might become quite muddy in the rainy season and quite dusty in summer. The houses were built with an eye to both function and the conditions of the climate, their wide roof overhangs protecting the walls from rain, their interior spaces flexible and multifunctional, with the same rooms serving as living space, sleeping space, and work space as the day's activities required. Village life was organized around the agricultural calendar in ways that touched every aspect of existence. The preparation of the paddy fields in spring, the transplanting of rice seedlings in early summer when the fields were flooded and the air smelled of mud and growing things, the long months of tending through summer heat, and the harvest in autumn that required the coordinated labor of every available pair of hands. These cycles gave the year its structure and its meaning. The festivals that marked the major transitions of the agricultural year were not simply celebrations. They were expressions of gratitude and hope, performances of the community's relationship with the spirits of the land and the forces of weather and growth. Farmers in the feudal system paid their taxes in rice, a portion of each year's harvest going to the domain lord who held authority over their land. The calculation of these taxes was a matter of considerable importance, as it determined how much of their own harvest the farming families could keep and how much would be taken. In good years, the arrangement was manageable. In poor years, when drought or flood or pest damaged the harvest, the fixed demands of taxation could create genuine hardship, and the relationship between farming communities and their overlords was sometimes strained by these pressures. Yet the picture of feudal rural life as uniformly grim would be inaccurate. Village communities had their own forms of self-governance, their own social bonds, their own seasonal pleasures. The cherry blossoms of spring drew people out to sit beneath the trees in a tradition of flower viewing that has continued to the present day. The summer festivals with their lanterns and drums and dancing were occasions of genuine community joy. The autumn moon was observed with quiet appreciation, and the first snow of winter was noted with something close to reverence. Even in the structure of a highly controlled social system, people found ways to inhabit the seasons with feeling and to mark the beauty of the world they lived in. The social structure of feudal Japan was organized according to a hierarchy that the Tokugawa shogunate, established at the beginning of the 17th century, formalized into four main categories. At the top stood the samurai, the warrior class whose function was military service and governance. Below them came the farmers, whose importance to the economy was recognized in their ranking even if their actual lives were often difficult. After the farmers came the artisans who made things, and below them the merchants who traded in things made by others. At the very margins of the formal social structure were those who performed work considered ritually impure, butchers and tanners and leather workers and certain kinds of performers. This ranking was not simply a theoretical abstraction. It had real consequences for how people dressed, where they could live, what occupations they could pursue, and how they were addressed in formal contexts. The samurai wore swords as a visible mark of their status, a privilege not extended to other classes. Their manner of dress, the cut and quality of their clothing, announced their position in the hierarchy to anyone they encountered. Crossing the boundaries of these categories was difficult and, for much of the period, legally restricted, though the reality of daily life always involved more mixing and movement than the formal structure suggested. Among the samurai themselves, there were enormous gradations of rank and wealth and power. At the very top stood the great domain lords, known as daimyo, men who held authority over entire provinces, commanded thousands of retainers, and lived in conditions of considerable magnificence. Below them were ranks of samurai who served as administrators, military officers, advisors, and functionaries, each level with its defined stipend and its defined responsibilities. At the lower end of the samurai spectrum were men whose warrior heritage was largely nominal, whose daily lives involved paperwork and bureaucratic duties rather than any kind of military activity, and whose stipends might be quite modest. The values that defined samurai identity were gathered under the concept now most commonly known by the term Bushido, the way of the warrior. This set of values was not a formal written code so much as a set of understandings that developed over centuries and were articulated in various ways in different periods. At its core, Bushido emphasized loyalty to one's lord above personal interest, the cultivation of courage and skill, and a particular relationship with death that refused to treat self-preservation as the highest good. The samurai was expected to face death with equanimity, not because death was desired or celebrated, but because excessive attachment to life was understood to compromise the quality of service. A warrior who was too concerned with surviving would make poor decisions in the situations where decisive action was required. The cultivation of a calm acceptance of impermanence, influenced by both Zen Buddhism and the Shinto understanding of the transience of the natural world, was understood as a form of mental training as important as any physical skill. This relationship with impermanence found expression in one of the most enduring aesthetic concepts of Japanese culture, the concept known as mono no aware, a phrase that might be translated as the pathos of things or the gentle sadness of passing. It describes the bittersweet feeling that arises from the recognition that all beautiful things are temporary, that the cherry blossom is most beautiful precisely because it falls, that the quality of light in late afternoon is most moving when you can feel the day already ending. This sensitivity to transience was not understood as pessimism but as a form of heightened appreciation, a way of attending to the world that made each moment of beauty more fully felt because it was recognized as unrepeatable. The poetry tradition of Japan gave this sensibility its most refined expression. The short poem forms that developed in Japan, particularly the tanka and later the haiku, were built around exactly this quality of attention, the capacity to notice a single, concrete detail of the world and to place it before the reader in a way that opened into something larger. The haiku form, perfected in the 17th century by the poet Basho and others, compressed enormous feeling into 17 syllables organized in 3 brief lines. The most celebrated examples have a quality of stillness and precision, a frog jumping into an old pond and the sound of water, the loneliness of a traveler's inn suggested by the cry of a bird in the night, autumn deepening in the silence after a temple bell has rung. Basho himself traveled extensively through the Japanese landscape, visiting famous sites and remote mountain paths, writing poems that recorded not just what he saw but the quality of attention with which he saw it. His travel writings, particularly the journey recorded in The Narrow Road to the Deep North, move through the landscape of northern Japan with a quality of sustained mindfulness that feels almost like an extended meditation. He noticed the moss on old stones, the way mist moved through mountain passes, the sound of rain on a thatched roof, the expression on the face of an old man he met on the road. Everything was worthy of attention, and attention itself was understood as a form of reverence. The arts of calligraphy and ink painting were also deeply embedded in this culture of careful attention. Calligraphy in the Chinese and Japanese tradition was not merely a practical skill for transmitting information. It was a complete art form in which the quality of the brush stroke, the rhythm of the hand moving across the paper, the balance of the characters on the page, all expressed something about the inner state and the training of the practitioner. A single character written with full concentration and skill could be displayed as an object of aesthetic contemplation in its own right, hung in the alcove of a tea room or a meditation hall where it could be looked at slowly, its meaning absorbed not only through the mind but through the eyes and the feeling it evoked. Ink painting in the Zen-influenced tradition favored simplicity and suggestion over detailed representation. A mountain might be indicated by a few brushstrokes, the rest of the composition left as empty white space that was not nothing but rather a different kind of presence, the space in which the mountain existed, the air and mist around it, the openness that gave the solid form its meaning. This capacity to use emptiness as an active element was one of the most distinctive qualities of Japanese aesthetic practice, whether in painting or in garden design or in the arrangement of a room. The Edo period, which began in the early 17th century when Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated power following a period of conflict and established the shogunate at the city of Edo, which would later become Tokyo, was in many respects the most quietly remarkable era of Japanese feudal history. For approximately 2.5 centuries, From around 1603 until the middle of the 19th century, Japan experienced a degree of internal peace that was extraordinary by the standards of world history. There were no major internal wars during this period. The elaborate system of controls that the Tokugawa shogunate put in place, including requirements that domain lords alternate their residence between their home provinces and the capital at Edo, effectively prevented the accumulation of power that might have challenged central authority. This long peace had profound effects on Japanese society and culture. The samurai class, no longer required for the military function that had originally defined it, increasingly turned its energies toward administration, scholarship, and the cultivation of the arts. Many samurai became bureaucrats and officials, managers of the complex administrative apparatus of their domains. Others became teachers of martial arts, keeping alive the physical traditions of their class in a context where those traditions had become largely ceremonial rather than practically necessary. Others pursued poetry, painting, the tea ceremony, and other cultural practices with the same focused dedication that earlier generations had brought to military preparation. The merchant class, despite its relatively low formal status in the social hierarchy, prospered during the Edo period in ways that gave it growing cultural influence. The merchants of the great cities, particularly Osaka and Edo, developed their own distinctive cultural traditions, a lively urban culture that found expression in kabuki theater, in the woodblock print art form known as ukiyo-e, in popular fiction, and in the pleasure districts where geisha and musicians performed for wealthy patrons. This urban popular culture was vibrant and sometimes satirical, capable of gentle mockery of both the samurai elite and the merchant class itself. Ukiyo-e, which might be translated as pictures of the floating world, was a form of woodblock printing that produced images in relatively large numbers, making visual art accessible to people who could not afford painted scrolls or hanging screens. The great masters of this form, artists such as Hokusai and Hiroshige, created images that combined technical virtuosity with a particular quality of atmospheric feeling. Hiroshige's landscape prints are perhaps the most immediately recognizable. Their depictions of the famous road stations along the Tokaido Highway, of rain falling on travelers crossing a bridge, of snow blanketing a mountain village, of the sun setting over the sea, capturing something of the mood and texture of the Japanese landscape that continues to feel resonant and true. Hokusai's great series of views of Mount Fuji explored the mountain from dozens of different distances and angles, finding in this single subject an inexhaustible variety of composition and light and season. Mount Fuji itself, the perfect volcanic cone that rises above the plains west of Edo, was and remains the most iconic feature of the Japanese landscape. A mountain whose form is so clean and symmetrical that it seems almost too perfect to be natural. In feudal Japan, it was both a physical landmark and a spiritual presence, a place of pilgrimage for those who climbed to its summit, a constant reference point for those who lived in its shadow. The period of isolation that Japan maintained through much of the Edo period, known as Sakoku or closed country, was one of the most unusual experiments in national policy in recorded history. Beginning in the 1630s, the Tokugawa shogunate gradually restricted and then largely prohibited contact with the outside world, limiting trade to a very small number of carefully managed exchanges, principally with Dutch and Chinese merchants at the port of Nagasaki, where Dutch traders were confined to a small artificial island in the harbor. Japanese subjects were prohibited from leaving the country, and the death penalty was prescribed for those who attempted to return after having done so. The motivations behind this policy were complex, involving concerns about the political influence of Christian missionaries who had been active in Japan in the preceding century, anxieties about the destabilizing effects of foreign trade and ideas, and the desire to maintain the internal stability that the Tokugawa system had so carefully constructed. Whatever its causes, the policy of isolation shaped Japanese society in profound ways over the more than 2 centuries of its maintenance. The country developed according to its own internal logic, without the disruptions and exchanges that contact with the wider world might have introduced, producing a culture of remarkable internal consistency and refinement. It is worth noting that isolation did not mean stagnation. Japanese society during the Edo period was in many ways dynamic and creative, its cities growing, its popular culture flourishing, its scholarship deepening. The study of Japanese classical literature experienced a revival that produced new interest in the ancient texts and traditions of the imperial period. Schools of philosophy and ethics engaged seriously with questions about the nature of good governance and the responsibilities of those in positions of authority. Agricultural techniques improved, supporting a growing population. The infrastructure of roads and transportation networks was maintained and in some areas improved, knitting the country together in ways that would prove important in the following century. The domain system through which Japan was governed during the Edo period meant that the country was composed of hundreds of relatively autonomous territories, each governed by its own lord according to its own particular traditions and local conditions, within the framework of rules and expectations that the shogunate maintained. Traveling through Japan during this period would have meant crossing from domain to domain through carefully controlled checkpoints, encountering different local customs and dialects and specialties, noticing the particular character of each place while recognizing the shared underlying culture that connected them all. Some domains became known for particular products or traditions. Certain regions were associated with specific styles of pottery or weaving or lacquerwork, reflecting the concentration of particular skills in local communities where master craftsmen trained apprentices who trained their own apprentices across many generations, each transmission deepening the accumulated knowledge and refining the techniques. A potter in a village associated with a particular ceramic tradition carried within him not just his own learning but the distilled experience of perhaps 10 or 20 generations before him, each of whom had worked with the same local clay and the same basic forms, finding within those constraints an almost infinite variety of expression. The relationship between master and apprentice in the craft traditions of feudal Japan was one of the most important structures through which knowledge and skill were preserved and transmitted. An apprentice entered the workshop of a master, often as a young teenager, and spent years first in the role of servant and general helper before being permitted to attempt the craft itself under guidance. The transmission of skill was not primarily verbal or textual. It happened through watching, through doing, through the thousands of repetitions that gradually trained the body to move in the right way, to feel when the clay was at the right consistency or the blade needed another pass on the stone. Words could point toward what was needed, but the actual learning happened in the hands and in the accumulated hours of practice. This model of learning through sustained practice and attentive imitation was not limited to craft. It shaped the transmission of martial arts, of musical traditions, of the tea ceremony, of no theater, of calligraphy, of almost every form of skilled practice. The relationship between teacher and student was one of the most fundamental in the social fabric of feudal Japan, and the obligations it created ran in both directions, the student owing respect and loyalty and dedicated effort, the teacher owing genuine attention and the full transmission of what he knew. No theatre, one of the oldest theatrical forms in the world still regularly performed, developed in the feudal period under the patronage of the shogunate and the warrior class. It is a form of extraordinary stylization and slowness, its actors moving with a quality of deliberate, weighted presence that is quite unlike anything in the theatrical traditions of other cultures. The masks worn by no actors are carved wooden faces of remarkable subtlety, their expressions seemingly neutral at first glance but capable of appearing to shift between joy and sorrow depending on the angle of light and the tilt of the performer's head. A single no performance might last several hours, its pace so slow that impatient observers sometimes found it incomprehensible, while those attuned to its rhythms experienced something close to a meditative state, their ordinary sense of time gently dissolved. The music of no, the low drone of the flute, the sharp crack of the hand drum, the deep resonance of the larger drum, created a sound world that was unlike ordinary musical experience. It was meant to be felt in the body as much as heard with the ears, its irregular rhythms and long silences creating a texture of attention that held the audience in a particular state between waking and something else, not sleep exactly, but a softening of the ordinary boundaries of alertness. The seasons in Japan were observed with an intensity of attention that expressed itself through art, poetry, ceremony, and the design of interior and exterior spaces. Seasonal imagery permeated every aspect of culture. The pattern on a kimono announced the season through its motifs: plum blossoms for early spring, maple leaves for autumn, snow-laden pine branches for winter. The food served at a formal meal reflected the season in its ingredients and in its presentation: a single plum blossom floating on clear soup in early spring, grilled pine mushrooms in autumn, the first bonito of summer presented with the pride of a seasonal milestone. This deep attunement to seasonal change was itself a form of practice, a continuous reminder of the impermanence of all conditions, of the beauty available in each particular moment that could not be repeated or extended. The cherry blossoms fell. The summer heat gave way to the cooler evenings of early autumn. The leaves turned and fell. The first snow arrived. And then, with the lengthening of days and the earliest hints of warmth, the plum trees blossomed again, and the cycle continued, each turning offering its particular qualities of light and smell and feeling, each one carrying the memory of all the previous years in which the same turning had been experienced and observed. Within the domain households of the samurai class, women occupied positions that combined genuine responsibility with significant constraint. The wife of a domain lord managed a large and complex household, overseeing servants and finances, maintaining social relationships with the wives of other lords, and raising children according to the values of the warrior class. Her role required intelligence and organizational skill and a particular form of social adeptness, the ability to navigate the hierarchies and expectations of her world with grace and without obvious misstep. Women of the samurai class were educated in the cultural practices appropriate to their station, in calligraphy and poetry, in the tea ceremony, in music, in the social forms that governed formal occasions. Some women were also trained in certain martial arts, particularly the use of the naginata, a bladed weapon on a long pole, which was considered appropriate for women of the warrior class as a means of defending the household in the absence of male members. This martial training was understood as continuous with the values of courage and composed readiness that the samurai tradition upheld for both men and women. The literary tradition of Japan had from its earliest period included significant contributions from women writers. The great prose works of the Heian period, before the era of the samurai's rise to dominance, had been produced largely by women of the court, whose diaries and tales offered intimate accounts of the refined and melancholy world of the imperial aristocracy. This tradition of women's literary expression continued in various forms through the feudal period, in the poetry collected in imperial anthologies, in the letters and diaries that have survived from samurai households, in the songs and performance traditions maintained by accomplished women in the entertainment quarters of the great cities. The city of Edo, which grew from a small castle town at the beginning of the Tokugawa period into one of the largest cities in the world by its close, was a remarkable expression of what the long peace had made possible. By the 18th century, Edo's population likely exceeded 1 million, making it comparable in size to London or Paris at the same period. Its streets stretched in every direction from the great castle at its center, a castle whose walls and moats still define the heart of what is now Tokyo. The city was organized into distinct neighborhoods whose character differed as much as those of any great city, the samurai districts of quiet compounds and wide streets giving way to the dense commercial neighborhoods of the commoner city, with its narrow lanes and crowded market streets and the smell of charcoal smoke and soy sauce and the particular mingled fragrance of a large human settlement in a pre-industrial age. The neighborhoods of the commoner city in Edo had their own complex social life, organized around a mixture of occupation and geography. A tenement building might house dozens of families in individual small rooms that opened onto a shared courtyard where water was drawn and clothes were washed and children played and neighbors exchanged the gossip of the day. Community life in these dense urban neighborhoods was built on proximity and mutual dependence. Neighbors watched each other's children and shared information about where to buy the best fish or the freshest vegetables and helped each other in the emergencies that arose in lives without formal safety nets. The festivals of the urban neighborhoods were occasions of community expression that could be both solemn and exuberant, sometimes within the same event. The portable shrines carried through the streets during neighborhood festivals were accompanied by the beating of drums and the chanting of the bearers, a collective physical effort that expressed the shared energy of the community. The lantern festivals of summer, when thousands of paper lanterns were set floating on rivers and harbor waters to guide the spirits of the dead back to the world beyond, created scenes of extraordinary beauty, the water surface covered with small lights moving gently with the current, the darkness around them soft and close. The food culture of the Edo period city reflected the diversity of a large population with access to the products of both sea and land. Street food vendors moved through the neighborhoods with portable cooking apparatus, selling grilled skewers and noodle soups and small cakes of rice and bean paste, calling out in distinctive voices that regular customers would have recognized from a distance. The restaurants and tea houses that lined the busier streets offered sit-down meals ranging from the simple and inexpensive to the elaborate and refined, and the culture of eating out that developed in Edo period cities was in some ways remarkably modern, with establishments known for specific regional cuisines and knowledgeable customers with strong opinions about where to find the best version of a particular dish. Sushi in the form recognizable today, individual pieces of seafood placed on small mounds of vinegared rice and eaten immediately, was a product of Edo period street food culture, a quick and practical way of eating the fresh seafood available from Tokyo Bay. Soba, thin buckwheat noodles served in clear broth, was another Edo period staple whose clean, subtle flavor seemed to embody the same aesthetic values as the culture more broadly, the preference for quality and simplicity over complexity and richness. The shogunate's elaborate system of rules and surveillance maintained internal order but also required considerable administrative effort to sustain. The requirement that domain lords travel to Edo regularly and maintain residences there, a system known as sankinkotai, was one of the shogunate's most effective tools for preventing the accumulation of independent power in the provinces. The processions by which lords traveled to and from Edo were themselves significant cultural events, long columns of samurai retainers moving along the great highways in ceremonial order, the population of the villages they passed through coming out to observe and to clear the road as the procession approached. The highways of the Edo period, particularly the Tokaido Road that connected Edo to Kyoto along the Pacific coast, were maintained transportation corridors supporting not only these official processions but a considerable volume of commercial and personal travel. Travelers moved along these roads in both directions at all times of year. Pilgrims headed to famous shrines and temples, merchants carrying goods between cities, scholars and artists seeking experience and learning, ordinary people visiting relatives or seeking employment in the cities. The post towns along these highways, with their inns and tea houses and particular local specialties sold to passing travelers, became small worlds of human connection and commercial life sustained by the steady flow of people moving through. The inns along the great roads offered travelers a range of accommodation from the simple to the comfortable, with tatami-matted rooms where guests spread their sleeping mats on the floor and lay beneath quilts, falling asleep to the sounds of the inn around them, the distant murmur of other guests, the calling of an owl outside, the settling of the wooden building in the night. The bath that concluded the day's traveling, hot water in a deep cedar tub, was one of the great pleasures available to the tired traveler, a ritual of cleansing and warmth that the Japanese tradition has always valued with particular depth. The communal bathhouse was an institution of neighborhood life in the cities as well, a place where the day's fatigue was released and where neighbors encountered each other in an atmosphere of easy sociality that crossed some of the more formal lines of daily interaction. The legacy of feudal Japan is not something that ended cleanly when the Meiji Restoration brought the feudal order to a close in the second half of the 19th century. Traditions rarely end so abruptly. What happened was rather a transformation, a process by which the values and practices and aesthetic sensibilities of the feudal period were carried forward into a new context, some of them strengthened by the consciousness of change around them, some modified to fit new circumstances, some genuinely lost but preserved in memory and in the cultural imagination. The martial arts traditions of the samurai became formalized systems of physical and mental training, practiced today by millions of people around the world who find in the disciplines of kendo and judo and aikido and the others something more than athletic exercise, a form of embodied philosophy that asks the practitioner to be fully present, to move from a settled center, to engage with challenge without panic and without aggression. The tea ceremony continues to be practiced and taught, its movements as deliberate and its silence as intentional as they were in the 16th century. The great temples and Zen gardens of Kyoto receive visitors from every corner of the world who come to sit beside raked gravel and pruned pine trees and to experience something of the quality of attention those spaces were designed to encourage. The aesthetic values that shaped the material culture of feudal Japan, the preference for natural materials and honest craft, the appreciation of imperfection and age, the capacity to find beauty in simplicity, these have become significant presences in global culture, influencing design and architecture and the way people around the world think about the spaces they inhabit and the objects they use. Kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken ceramics with gold, has become a widely used metaphor for the value of acknowledging rather than concealing damage and difficulty, for the idea that things repaired can be more beautiful than things that were never broken. The literature that emerged from feudal Japan, the poetry of Basho and his contemporaries, the plays of No Theatre, the diaries and tales of both the aristocratic and the warrior classes, continues to be read and translated and considered by people who find in it a particular quality of honesty about the human experience, its transience and its small beauties, its loneliness and its moments of sudden, quiet joy. Perhaps what endures most deeply from the long centuries of feudal Japan is something harder to name than any specific practice or artifact. A quality of attention, a way of inhabiting time that is neither hurried nor resistant, that accepts the passing of seasons and the falling of blossoms not with grief exactly but with a kind of grateful sadness, recognizing in the impermanence of all things the very condition that makes beauty possible. In the sound of a temple bell fading over a mountain valley, in the reflection of a stone lantern in still water at dusk, in the careful gestures of a tea ceremony practiced in a small room while rain falls outside, something of that quality of attention is still present, still available to anyone who chooses to slow down enough to receive it. The mist is settling over the mountain forests now, and somewhere in the distance, a temple bell is sounding its deep, unhurried note, and the evening is becoming the night, and the lanterns in the wooden streets are glowing softly, and the great castle tower is a dark shape against a sky filled with stars, and all of it is very quiet, and all of it is very still, and all of it is, in the gentlest and most lasting sense, at rest.